When a ruthless tech CEO's laptop shatters, the only surviving photos of her late parents seem lost forever, until a quiet single father in a tiny repair shop uncovers something hidden in the drive that will change her life. In the heart of the city's towering financial district stood the sleek glass headquarters of Synexis Systems, one of the most powerful cybersecurity companies in the world. From the outside, the building looked less like an office and more like a monument to modern technology, its mirrored surface reflecting the skyline, its interior filled with silent AI systems, constantly analyzing markets, monitoring digital threats, and predicting global trends. At the top floor of that tower worked the woman who had built the company into a billion-dollar empire, Elena Voss. In boardrooms across the tech world, she was known by a nickname that both impressed and intimidated those who heard it, the Ice Queen. Elena had earned that reputation through years of sharp decisions and an unwavering commitment to efficiency. She believed leadership required absolute clarity, and emotions were obstacles that blurred judgment. Investors admired her, competitors feared her, and employees learned quickly that Elena Voss valued results above everything else. Her office perfectly reflected her philosophy. The vast room contained almost nothing personal, just a polished desk, several floating digital displays showing real-time analytics, and an advanced AI assistant quietly updating data streams along the glass wall behind her. To anyone who walked in, it felt less like the office of a person and more like the command center of a machine. Yet among all the high-tech tools surrounding her, one device held a unique place on Elena's desk, a slim black laptop she carried everywhere. Unlike the company's cloud servers or encrypted networks, this laptop wasn't connected to the outside world. It was private, protected by layers of encryption that only she could unlock. Officially, it stored a set of proprietary encryption keys used by Synexis to secure critical systems. Those keys alone made the device worth millions. But there was another reason Elena guarded it so closely, one she never discussed with colleagues or shareholders. Hidden within its storage were thousands of photographs from her past, images of a simpler life before corporate power, before investor meetings, before she became the woman everyone now called the Ice Queen. The photos showed a small apartment kitchen filled with warm afternoon light, her mother smiling as flour dusted the counter while baking cookies. Another showed her father kneeling beside a bicycle, steadying the handlebars while a young Elena nervously prepared to ride without training wheels. There were birthday parties with cheap decorations, summer afternoons in the park, and countless small moments that once defined the center of her world. Both of her parents had passed away years earlier, long before Synexis became the global company it was now. Those photos were the only pieces of them she still had, quiet reminders of a time when success meant making them proud rather than impressing shareholders. Yet Elena rarely allowed herself to look at them. Her life had moved forward too quickly, filled with endless negotiations, acquisitions, and strategic decisions. She convinced herself that focusing on the future was more productive than lingering in the past. On this particular evening, the city outside her office windows glowed with thousands of lights as the skyline shimmered against the dark sky. Elena had just finished an exhausting board meeting discussing a major acquisition that could expand Synexis' infrastructure across several districts of the city. The directors wanted a fast decision, pushing aggressively for growth and profit projections that promised enormous returns. Elena listened carefully, as she always did, analyzing the numbers with calm precision. To her, business was like solving a complex algorithm, every variable calculated, every risk measured. When the meeting ended, she remained alone in her office reviewing documents on her laptop. The encrypted device hummed softly as lines of data scrolled across the screen. Outside the glass walls, employees moved through the building like shadows, finishing their own late-night tasks. Elena stretched slightly, rubbing the tension from her neck. It had been another long day of negotiations and pressure, the kind that left little room for reflection. She stood from her desk, intending to pour a cup of coffee from the small machine near the window. As she turned, her hand brushed the edge of the desk. In that tiny moment, so quick it barely registered, her laptop shifted. Elena heard the faint scrape of metal sliding across polished glass. She turned instinctively, reaching out, but it was already too late. The device slipped from the edge and fell. The sound of it striking the marble floor echoed sharply through the silent office, a crack that felt strangely louder than it should have been. For a moment, Elena simply stared at the laptop lying on the ground. A strange uneasiness crept into her chest, something unfamiliar that she rarely experienced. She walked over slowly and picked it up. The screen flickered when she opened it, displaying a fragmented image before dissolving into darkness. She pressed the power button once. Nothing happened. Again, the laptop remained silent. Elena's calm expression didn't change, but inside, a cold realization settled. That single device contained not only the keys protecting parts of her company's network, but also the fragile digital memories of the two people she had loved most in the world. And now, in the quiet glow of her glass tower office, Elena Voss, CEO, strategist, the woman known as the Ice Queen, stood staring at a lifeless screen, realizing that something far more important than corporate data might have just been lost forever. By the next morning, Elena Voss had already summoned the best technical minds inside Synexis Systems to examine the damaged laptop. The company's elite engineers treated the device with the same seriousness they would give a national security breach. In a pristine laboratory several floors below her office, specialists carefully disassembled the machine under bright diagnostic lights, running advanced recovery programs and analyzing the internal storage through high-end forensic tools. Elena stood nearby, arms folded, her expression calm but her mind racing with quiet urgency. The lead engineer eventually removed his headset and shook his head slowly. The fall had physically damaged the drive's controller, and several key sectors appeared corrupted beyond recognition. Their software attempted multiple reconstruction methods, but every attempt failed to access the core encrypted storage blocks. "We can rebuild some fragments," the engineer explained cautiously, "but the encryption keys are likely lost. Without those, the data structure collapses." Elena stared at the inactive laptop on the workbench. She had faced billion-dollar risks before without hesitation, yet this situation felt strangely personal. Losing those encryption keys would be a serious operational setback, but what weighed more heavily in her thoughts were the photographs hidden deep in that drive, images of her parents she had never trusted to cloud storage. Those moments of laughter, birthdays, and quiet family evenings existed nowhere else. Elena had always assumed the device was safe. Now that assumption felt painfully naive. After several more hours of failed attempts, the engineers reluctantly delivered their final verdict. The damage was severe enough that recovery might be impossible without physically reconstructing parts of the drive's internal structure. One junior technician hesitated before speaking. "There is another option," he said quietly. Elena looked up sharply. "Explain." The technician shifted nervously. "There's a local repair specialist in the city who sometimes recovers drives companies give up on. He doesn't use the typical corporate labs, more like old-school manual reconstruction." The idea sounded absurd to Elena. Synexis owned some of the most advanced digital recovery tools in the world, and now she was being told that a small, independent repair shop might succeed where her own engineers had failed. Yet desperation forced her to consider possibilities she normally would have dismissed instantly. By early afternoon, Elena left the towering Synexis headquarters and drove toward a quieter district on the edge of the city. The skyscrapers gradually gave way to smaller buildings, modest storefronts, and narrow streets filled with local businesses. It felt like a completely different world compared to the sleek corporate environment she lived in daily. Eventually, she found the address, a narrow repair shop tucked between a bakery and a small convenience store. The sign above the door read simply, "Carter Repairs, Fixing What Matters." Elena paused before stepping inside, as if crossing an invisible boundary between two very different lives. The shop was warm and cluttered in a way that felt strangely comforting. Shelves held old computer parts, tangled cables, and small tools neatly arranged across a wooden workbench. Unlike the sterile labs at Synexis, this space carried the scent of soldering metal and fresh coffee. Behind the counter stood a man in his late 30s wearing a simple gray shirt with rolled-up sleeves. He looked up from a half-disassembled laptop when the door opened. "Afternoon," he said calmly. "What seems to be the problem?" Elena placed her damaged laptop carefully on the counter. It suffered a physical fall. Several engineers have already attempted recovery, but the data remains inaccessible. The man wiped his hands with a cloth and examined the device without any sign of intimidation. "Name's David Carter. Mind if I take a look?" Elena nodded as he watched as he opened the casing with practiced precision. His movements were patient and deliberate, nothing like the hurried urgency she had witnessed earlier in the corporate lab. David studied the drive for several minutes before speaking again. Impact damaged the controller, but the memory chips might still hold the raw data. Elena leaned forward slightly. "Can you recover it?" David didn't answer immediately. Instead, he connected the drive to a custom diagnostic board and ran a quiet scan on his computer. Lines of unfamiliar code began scrolling across the screen. "Maybe," he said finally, "but this kind of work takes time. Rebuilding corrupted sectors isn't something you rush." Elena reached into her bag and placed a checkbook on the counter. "I'm willing to pay whatever it costs." David barely glanced at it. "Money doesn't speed up patience," he replied calmly. The answer caught Elena off guard. In her world, nearly every problem could be solved faster with enough funding or pressure. Yet here was someone who seemed completely unaffected by the authority or wealth she represented. For the first time that day, Elena realized she was no longer in control of the situation. She stepped back and watched as David carefully began dismantling the damaged drive under a small magnifying lamp. Outside the shop window, the quiet neighborhood continued its normal rhythm. Customers visiting the bakery next door, children walking home from school, ordinary life unfolding far from the polished towers of corporate power. Elena sat in a chair near the workbench, uncertain how long the process might take. She had come expecting either a quick solution or a quick failure. Instead, she found herself in a place where patience mattered more than status, and where a single technician might hold the only chance of restoring the memories she feared were gone forever. The afternoon light slowly shifted across the windows of Carter Repairs as David continued working with steady concentration at his wooden bench. Elena Voss sat quietly nearby, something she rarely did in her normal life. At Synexus headquarters, every minute was scheduled, every decision urgent, every conversation measured by productivity. But here, time moved differently. David had explained that recovering damaged data wasn't about speed, but patience. The corrupted drive needed to be carefully analyzed sector by sector, and sometimes the process required rebuilding digital pathways that had been shattered during the fall. Elena watched as lines of code streamed across David's monitor, far less polished than the advanced AI diagnostics used in her company's labs, but strangely more deliberate. He adjusted a small recovery interface he had built himself, guiding the system through fragments of the damaged storage, like an archaeologist carefully uncovering pieces of a lost artifact. Every so often he paused to check the physical memory chips through a magnifying lens, ensuring the fragile components were still transmitting readable signals. Elena had initially planned to stay only a short time, but hours passed as she remained in the quiet shop, strangely unwilling to leave. The calm atmosphere was unfamiliar, yet oddly comforting. Unlike the sterile silence of her corporate office, this room felt lived in. A small fan hummed in the corner, papers were scattered across a nearby desk, and a faint smell of warm bread drifted in occasionally from the bakery next door. For someone who spent most of her life surrounded by polished glass and perfectly organized data systems, the imperfection of the space felt surprisingly human. Eventually, David leaned closer to the screen, narrowing his eyes as a new set of recovered sectors appeared in the reconstruction program. "Interesting," he murmured. Elena straightened in her chair. "Did you find something?" David didn't answer immediately. Instead, he began manually reconstructing the corrupted file index, linking fragments of data that had been scattered across damaged sections of the drive. The process looked painstakingly slow, but after several minutes, a directory tree slowly began forming on the monitor. "There's more here than your engineers thought," he said calmly. Elena moved closer to the workbench, watching as the system assembled a list of partially recovered folders. Most of them were encrypted corporate files, documents, system keys, and security configurations tied to Synaxis operations. But one folder appeared differently. Its label was faint, almost erased by corruption, yet the reconstruction software managed to rebuild enough characters to reveal a name: family. Elena felt a sudden tightening in her chest. David clicked on the folder and waited as the system attempted to rebuild the contents. At first, only fragments appeared: pixelated images, incomplete thumbnails struggling to load. Then, slowly, one photograph restored itself completely on the screen. It showed a younger Elena standing in a small kitchen beside her mother, who was laughing as flour dusted the countertop. The sunlight in the photo gave the entire scene a warm, golden glow. Elena stared at the image without speaking. She hadn't seen it in nearly 10 years. David quietly continued reconstructing the folder, pulling together damaged data blocks one by one. Another photo appeared, this time of Elena's father crouching beside a small bicycle in a park, his hands steadying the handlebars while a nervous 8-year-old Elena balanced carefully. The image was imperfect, with a few faint digital scars from the corrupted sectors, but the moment was unmistakable. Elena felt memories rushing back faster than she expected. She remembered the smell of the grass in that park, the sound of her father laughing when she finally pedaled forward on her own. For years, she had buried those memories beneath layers of professional ambition, telling herself that focusing on the past only slowed progress. But seeing the photos restored felt like reopening a door she hadn't realized she had closed so tightly. David leaned back slightly, allowing the recovery process to continue running. "Looks like most of this folder survived," he said gently. "The corruption hid it behind broken indexing. Your engineers probably never saw it." Elena swallowed quietly. "I thought they were gone." For the first time since she arrived, her voice carried a softness rarely heard in Synaxis boardrooms. David glanced at her briefly, but didn't ask questions. He understood that some things didn't require explanation. The program restored several more images: birthday parties with colorful paper decorations, family dinners in a small apartment, and a blurry photo of Elena as a teenager sitting between her parents on an old couch. None of the pictures were professionally taken, and many were imperfect in ways that made them feel even more real. Elena reached out instinctively and touched the edge of the screen, as if confirming they were truly there. The powerful CEO who dominated global cybersecurity negotiations suddenly looked less like the ice queen investors described, and more like someone rediscovering a part of herself she had forgotten she had. David quietly saved the recovered folder onto a secure external drive, ensuring the recovered data would remain safe regardless of the damaged laptop. The process had taken hours of careful effort, but the result was something far more valuable than either of them had expected when Elena first walked into the shop. For Elena, the files on that screen were not just images, they were pieces of a life she had nearly lost forever. And as she looked at the smiling faces of her parents glowing softly from the monitor, she realized that the man sitting beside the workbench hadn't just repaired a broken device. In a quiet repair shop far from the glass towers of Synaxis systems, David Carter had just restored the most important memory she still had. The quiet glow of the recovery screen filled the small repair shop as the last of the reconstructed files finished saving onto David's external drive. Elena remained standing beside the workbench, still absorbing the reality of what she had just seen. The photographs of her parents had felt almost like ghosts, returning memories she had long convinced herself were safely locked away in the past. Yet now they sat in front of her again, vivid and real, recovered from fragments that even her company's advanced engineers had declared lost forever. David carefully disconnected the diagnostic board and closed the recovery program on his computer. His movements were calm and unhurried, as though restoring a piece of someone's life was simply another ordinary task in his day. Elena found that strangely remarkable. In her world, extraordinary results were usually followed by celebration, announcements, or financial calculations. Here, David simply cleaned his tools and placed the damaged laptop gently back on the table. Outside, the afternoon sun had begun to dip lower, casting warm light through the shop window and across the cluttered workspace. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Elena's attention wandered around the shop, noticing details she hadn't really registered earlier. A small corkboard hung on the wall beside David's desk, covered in drawings made with bright crayons and markers. Most of them were clearly done by a child, Simple houses, smiling stick figures, and colorful scribbles meant to represent flowers or animals. One drawing in particular caught her eye. It showed a man standing beside a computer with tools scattered around him. Above the picture, written in uneven letters, were the words, "My dad fixes everything." Elena was still looking at the drawing when the back door of the shop suddenly opened. A small girl stepped inside, carrying a backpack that looked almost too big for her shoulders. She stopped the moment she saw Elena standing there. Her eyes widened with curiosity. "Dad?" she called out. "Customer?" David glanced up and smiled. "Hey, Maya. Yeah, just finishing up some work." The girl walked over confidently, dropping her backpack onto a nearby chair. She looked at Elena without any hesitation or awareness of who she was. In the corporate world Elena inhabited, nearly everyone treated her with careful respect, always aware of her power and position. But Maya's gaze carried none of that caution, only simple curiosity. "Is your computer broken?" Maya asked directly. Elena blinked slightly, surprised by the straightforward question. "It was. Your dad fixed it." Maya grinned proudly and turned toward David. "See, I told you people need you." David chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I think the computer needed me more than the person did." Elena almost smiled at that. Watching the exchange between father and daughter stirred something unfamiliar in her chest. Maya moved around the shop like she belonged there, completely, picking up a small screwdriver from the bench and pretending to inspect a keyboard, as if she were already learning her father's craft. "Did you fix it good?" she asked. "I think so," David answered. "The important files are safe now." Maya nodded with exaggerated seriousness before turning back to Elena. "My dad fixes everything," she said proudly. "Computers, phones, bikes, even my school tablet when I spilled juice on it." David groaned lightly. "You're not supposed to advertise that last one." Elena let out a quiet laugh before she could stop herself. The sound felt strange coming from her own voice, as though she hadn't heard it in a long time. In the boardrooms of Synexis Systems, laughter was usually polite and measured, often used strategically in negotiations. But this moment felt different, unexpected, and genuine. Maya tilted her head slightly, studying Elena's expression. "You look happier now," she said innocently. Elena hesitated. The comment was simple, but it landed with surprising weight. She realized when she had first walked into the shop earlier that day, she had been tense and guarded, carrying the pressure of her corporate responsibilities like invisible armor. Now, after hours spent in this modest space, watching a patient technician rebuild lost data, that armor felt lighter somehow. David packed the recovered files carefully onto a secure drive and handed it to Elena. "Everything important should be here. I'd still recommend backing it up somewhere safer." Elena accepted the drive slowly. "I will." She glanced again at the drawings on the wall and the quiet comfort of the shop. This small place felt worlds away from the polished glass towers where she normally spent her days. Yet something about it seemed more real than the carefully controlled environment of Synexis headquarters. Watching David talk easily with his daughter, Elena began to realize just how different their priorities were. David valued patience, care, and time spent fixing things that mattered to people. Elena's world, by contrast, focused on efficiency, expansion, and profit margins measured in billions. For years, she had believed her version of success was the only path forward. But standing in that warm repair shop, listening to a child proudly declare that her dad could fix anything, Elena felt a quiet question forming in her mind. Perhaps there are some things success can't measure at all. And perhaps the life she had built, as powerful as it was, had been missing something she was only now beginning to understand. The towering glass headquarters of Synexis Systems looked exactly the same as it had the day Elena Voss first walked into David Carter's repair shop, but something inside her had quietly shifted. 2 days had passed since the recovery of her laptop files, yet the images of her parents still lingered vividly in her mind. The restored photographs were now safely backed up across multiple secure drives, but Elena found herself opening the folder more often than she expected. Each image carried a quiet reminder of the life she had lived before corporate success consumed every waking moment. That morning, as she entered the top-floor boardroom, the atmosphere felt as tense as ever. 12 directors sat around the long glass table, their tablets glowing with charts and projections for the acquisition they had been pushing for weeks. The deal promised enormous growth for Synexus, an opportunity to expand the company's infrastructure across a developing district of the city and strengthen its dominance in the cybersecurity industry. Elena had approved similar deals countless times before, without hesitation. In the language of business strategy, it was a perfect move: high profit margins, increased market control, and investor confidence. But now Elena knew something the board seemed unwilling to acknowledge. The district scheduled for redevelopment wasn't just empty real estate waiting for corporate expansion. It was a neighborhood filled with small businesses, repair shops, family stores, and independent technicians who depended on those spaces to survive. When Elena first saw the acquisition proposal weeks earlier, she had viewed it purely as a strategic opportunity. Now, however, she could picture the streets she had driven through on the way to David's shop. She could remember the bakery next door, the quiet storefronts, and the modest sign reading, "Carter Repairs, Fixing What Matters." The board meeting began with the usual presentations. One director stood near the digital display, highlighting growth projections that soared across the screen in confident upward curves. This acquisition secures Synexus's position as the dominant cybersecurity infrastructure provider in the region, he explained. Once redevelopment begins, the area will be converted into high-capacity server facilities and corporate offices. Another board member added, the existing businesses in the district will be compensated through relocation assistance. From a financial standpoint, the transition is entirely justified. Elena listened silently as the directors continued discussing logistics and investor responses. Their voices blended into the familiar rhythm of corporate strategy meetings, numbers, predictions, and calculations presented with confident certainty. In the past, Elena had thrived in this environment. She had built her reputation by making decisions quickly and without emotional hesitation. But today, as she sat at the head of the table, something felt different. She slowly opened her laptop, the same device that had fallen from her desk only days earlier. The screen lit up softly, displaying the familiar folders she had nearly lost forever. Almost automatically, she opened the one labeled Family. The first photo appeared instantly. Her mother standing in the kitchen with flour on her hands, laughing as sunlight poured through the window behind her. Elena stared at the image while the board continued debating timelines for the redevelopment project. Her mother had always believed that success wasn't measured by power or wealth, but by the way a person treated others. It was a lesson Elena had once taken seriously, long before the pressure of corporate leadership began shaping her decisions. She clicked to the next photo. Her father crouched beside a small bicycle in a park, steadying the handlebars as young Elena prepared to ride without training wheels. He had always told her that the strongest people weren't those who controlled everything around them, but those who helped others stand on their own. The voices around the table faded into the background as Elena absorbed the meaning of those memories. For years, she had justified ruthless decisions as necessary steps toward progress. Growth required sacrifice, the board often said. Businesses closed, neighborhoods changed, and smaller companies disappeared, but that was simply how the system worked. Yet now, Elena wondered whether she had accepted that logic too easily. The chair of the board finally turned toward her. "Elena, we're ready for the final approval. Once you sign off, we can move forward immediately." The room fell silent as every director looked toward her. Elena closed the photo folder slowly and rested her hands on the laptop. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to consider something beyond the spreadsheets and market projections. She thought about David working patiently at his repair bench, rebuilding corrupted sectors of her drive piece by piece. She thought about Maya proudly declaring that her father could fix anything. And she thought about the quiet values her parents had taught her long before she ever stepped into a boardroom. Elena looked up at the directors, her expression calm but different from the attached authority they were used to seeing. "We're not proceeding with the acquisition," she said quietly. For several seconds, no one spoke. One director leaned forward in disbelief. "Elena, the numbers clearly support this deal." She nodded. "I know." Another director frowned. "Then why reject it?" Elena closed her laptop and met their eyes. "Because growth that destroys the people who built the community isn't progress. It's just expansion without purpose." The board members exchanged stunned glances as Elena stood from her chair. For the first time since becoming CEO of Synexus Systems, Elena Voss had made a decision not based solely on profit or power, but on something far more human. And though the consequences of that choice were still uncertain, she knew one thing with complete clarity. Sometimes the most difficult decision in leadership wasn't choosing the most profitable path, but choosing the one that allowed you to remain the person you once promised to be. The announcement Elena Voss made in the Synexis boardroom traveled through the technology industry faster than anyone expected. Within hours, financial analysts, investors, and media outlets were discussing the decision that stunned the corporate world. Synexis Systems had officially rejected one of the most profitable acquisitions in its history. The redevelopment project that would have turned an entire district into corporate infrastructure was canceled under Elena's authority. Many executives across the industry struggled to understand why a CEO known for ruthless efficiency would suddenly abandon such a strategic opportunity. Investors questioned whether Elena had lost her edge. Business reporters debated whether the decision signaled weakness or a bold shift in leadership philosophy. Inside Synexis headquarters, employees whispered about the change they sensed in their CEO. For years, Elena Voss had been admired as a brilliant strategist who never allowed emotions to influence business decisions. Yet now she seemed to be leading the company in a new direction that no one had predicted. Within days of the announcement, Elena introduced a plan that surprised the board even more than her rejection of the acquisition. Instead of demolishing the district, Synexis would invest in the very community it had originally planned to replace. The initiative was called the Human Infrastructure Program, a project designed to support independent repair specialists, small technology businesses, and local service providers who helped everyday people maintain and protect their devices. Elena explained that while large corporations built powerful digital systems, communities relied on smaller technicians who solved practical problems face to face. These local experts were often overlooked by the corporate technology industry, despite playing an essential role in keeping digital life accessible. The program would provide funding, training, and secure network partnerships for independent repair businesses across the city. At first, some investors reacted with skepticism. Supporting small shops instead of expanding corporate control seemed like an unusual strategy for a cybersecurity giant. But Elena remained firm. She knew that the company's reputation had always been built on trust. Trust that Synexis would protect people's most valuable data and digital memories. By supporting the technicians who worked directly with customers, Synexis could strengthen that trust in ways traditional corporate expansion never could. Within weeks, the response from the public proved Elena's instincts were correct. Customers praised the company's commitment to community support, and several technology organizations expressed interest in adopting similar programs. What began as a controversial decision gradually transformed into a new standard for how large technology companies could work alongside local businesses rather than replacing them. For Elena, however, the most meaningful moment came quietly one afternoon several weeks later. After finishing a series of executive meetings, she left the towering Synexis headquarters and drove once again toward the smaller district at the edge of the city. The familiar streets felt different now, not as potential corporate assets, but as places filled with real lives and stories. When she reached Carter Repairs, the modest shop looked exactly as she remembered it. The small sign above the door still read, "Fixing what matters." Elena stepped inside, hearing the soft hum of tools and the faint tapping of keys from David's workstation. David looked up and smiled in mild surprise when he saw her. "Everything still working?" he asked casually, wiping his hands on a cloth. Elena held up her laptop slightly. "Perfectly," she said. For a moment they simply stood there, the quiet familiarity of the shop surrounding them. The same corkboard drawings still decorated the wall, and the smell of warm bread drifted in from the bakery next door. Elena realized she had come not because something needed fixing, but because she wanted to return to the place where something inside her had quietly changed. David gestured toward a chair. "You look less stressed than last time." Elena laughed softly. "That's because the crisis is over." He tilted his head curiously. "Good outcome?" Elena nodded. "Better than I expected." She hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "The district redevelopment project was canceled." David blinked in surprise. "Really?" Elena smiled faintly. "Instead of replacing small businesses, Synexis is investing in them." David leaned back slightly, clearly processing the idea. "That's not the usual corporate strategy." Elena looked around the shop once more, her eyes resting briefly on the drawing that read, "My dad fixes everything." "Maybe the usual strategy needed changing," she said quietly. At that moment, the back door burst open again, just like before. Maya rushed in carrying a notebook from school and immediately spotted Elena. "Hey, the laptop lady!" she exclaimed happily. Elena couldn't help smiling at the nickname. Maya dropped her backpack and ran over to the workbench. "Did your computer break again?" she asked happily. "No," Elena replied warmly. "It's working perfectly now." Maya nodded proudly and pointed toward her father. "See, I told you my dad fixes everything." David chuckled while Elena laughed, the sound feeling easier and more natural than it once had.
Standing there in the modest repair shop, Elena realized something she had overlooked for years while building her empire. Technology could protect information, rebuild damaged systems, and connect people across the world. But the most important part of any system was still the human beings behind it, the people who cared enough to fix things when they broke. Weeks earlier, Elena had walked into Carter Repairs desperate to recover lost files from a shattered laptop. But what she hadn't expected was that the experience would restore something far more important than digital data. In a quiet shop far from the glass towers of corporate power, a single father's patience and kindness had reminded her what success was truly supposed to mean. And from that moment forward, Elena Voss knew her company would never measure success the same way again.
If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to Drew Daily Stories for more powerful, emotional stories every day. Your support helps us keep bringing inspiring moments, life lessons, and unforgettable characters.